5 seconds. That was all the time that separated a life of supreme power from a gruesome, fiery death. The massive oak doors of the cathedral burst open, not with the ceremonial grace of a wedding procession, but with the frantic, desperate energy of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Keisha, 23 years old and draped in a dress that was more mud-stained rags than fabric, sprinted down the aisle. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her bare feet slapping against the cold, polished marble floor, creating a sound that echoed like gunshots in the silent, hallowed hall. The guests, a terrifying assembly of the city's most dangerous criminal elite, froze in collective shock. Standing at the altar was Junho, the young, stoic boss of the Southern Syndicate, his hand moments away from clasping the hand of his bride. He looked up, his eyes widening not in anger, but in sheer confusion as the blur of brown fabric rushed toward him. Keisha didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply lunged. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she grabbed the lapels of his $3,000 tuxedo and yanked him backward with such ferocity that he stumbled off the dais. "Run," she croaked, her voice parched and cracking. Before the shocked security detail could even draw their weapons, she dragged the bewildered Mafia Don toward the side exit, throwing them both out into the alleyway. Exactly 5 seconds later, the world ended. A deafening roar shattered the afternoon calm as the altar where Junho had been standing erupted into a ball of violent orange flame. The shockwave blew the stained glass windows outward in a shower of deadly confetti, and the ground shook with the fury of the blast. In the dusty alley, covered in debris and ringing silence, Junho stared at the trembling woman on top of him, his mind unable to process that this homeless stranger had just snatched him from the jaws of death. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Before we dive into the mystery of how a woman invisible to society saved the city's most powerful man, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Have you ever helped someone who couldn't pay you back? Let us know in the comments below. Now, let's rewind the clock to see how fate brought these two together. The morning had begun with a suffocating sense of dread that hung over the city like a heavy fog, specifically centered around the Grand St. Jude's Cathedral. Inside the vestry, Junho adjusted his silk tie, staring into the mirror at a man he barely recognized. He was the head of the Southern Syndicate, a man who commanded legions of loyal soldiers and controlled the shipping lanes of the entire coast. Yet today, he felt like a prisoner walking to the gallows. This was not a wedding born of love. It was a merger, a cold calculation written in blood and money. He was to marry Sumin, the icy, sharp-tongued daughter of Chairman Park, the leader of the Northern Cartel. The union was supposed to end a decade-long war that had left the streets painted red, but Junho felt a twisting knot in his gut that no amount of scotch could dissolve. He looked at his reflection, noting the dark circles under his eyes that the makeup artist had tried to hide. He was a man who valued honor and loyalty above all else, traits that were becoming dangerously obsolete in his world. His bodyguard, a hulking man named Daehyun, stood by the door, checking his earpiece with professional paranoia. Junho sighed, turning away from the mirror. He didn't want this. He didn't want the power if it meant shackling himself to a family known for treachery. Chairman Park was a viper, a man who smiled while stabbing you in the kidney, and Sumin was her father's daughter in every way. But the peace treaty was signed, and the families were waiting. Junho straightened his jacket, steeling himself for the performance of a lifetime, unaware that the only person who actually cared about his life was currently rummaging through a dumpster 3 blocks away. Keisha's world was a stark, brutal contrast to the velvet and gold of the cathedral. At 23, she carried the weight of a lifetime of hardship in the slump of her shoulders. Her dress, once a warm chocolate brown, was now tattered and stained with the grime of the city streets, hanging loosely on her emaciated frame. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, her stomach a cramping knot of pain that she had learned to ignore. The city was a cruel host to those without a roof, and Keisha had learned to be invisible, to keep her head down and her eyes averted. She moved through the alleyways like a ghost, ignored by the commuters rushing to their high-rise offices and the tourists snapping photos of the skyline. But despite her circumstances, Keisha possessed a spirit that the streets hadn't managed to break. She had a sharp mind and observant eyes, noticing things that others missed in their haste. She saw the kindness in the eyes of the bakery owner, who sometimes left a bag of stale rolls by the back door, and she saw the cruelty in the teenagers who threw stones at the pigeons. Today, her search for sustenance had brought her near the cathedral, drawn not by faith, but by the scent of expensive catering. She knew that rich people wasted food, and where there was a wedding, there were leftovers. She crept toward the loading dock behind the church, hoping to find a discarded tray of hors d'oeuvres or perhaps a bruised fruit. The alley was shadowed and cool, a respite from the harsh sun, but as she drew closer to the rear entrance of the church, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't the hunger gnawing at her, it was a primal sense of danger. She paused, pressing herself against the rough brick wall, her breath held tight in her chest. A black van with tinted windows was idling near the back entrance, looking out of place among the catering trucks and floral delivery vans. It was sleek, menacing, and silent. Keisha watched as two men stepped out. They weren't wearing the uniforms of the catering staff, nor the standard security suits of the Mafia families. They wore tactical gear, efficient and deadly, and they were carrying large, heavy duffel bags with a care that suggested the contents were volatile. Keisha knew she should turn around. The first rule of survival on the streets was to mind your own business. Seeing things you weren't supposed to see was a quick way to end up as a missing person statistic that no one would investigate. But something kept her rooted to the spot. She watched as the men moved with practiced stealth toward a maintenance door that led to the church's basement, directly beneath the main altar. Curiosity, dangerous and compelling, pulled her closer. She crept behind a stack of wooden pallets, straining her ears to catch their hushed conversation. The men were speaking in low, urgent tones. "The timer is set for the iDose," one of them grunted, checking a device on his wrist. "Chairman Park wants it to be definitive." No survivors on the groom's side. Keisha's blood ran cold. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. This wasn't just a robbery or a disruption, it was an assassination. A massacre. She pieced it together quickly. The groom, the man she had seen on the news, the handsome Korean business mogul, was walking into a trap set by his own future father-in-law. The cruelty of it was staggering. They were going to blow him up at the very moment he pledged his life to their family. The injustice of it ignited a spark of anger in Keisha's chest. She had lost everything to the indifference of the world, her job, her home, her family, but she had never lost her humanity. She couldn't walk away. She couldn't let a man die just because he was rich and she was poor. The line between good and evil wasn't drawn by bank accounts, it was drawn by actions. And walking away now would make her no better than the monsters planting the bomb. She looked at the heavy oak door the men had disappeared through, and then at the main entrance of the church where the guests were arriving. She had to warn him. She had to stop the wedding. But who would listen to a homeless woman in a tattered dress? Who would believe her? She looked down at her dirty hands and her bare feet. She was nobody. But right now, she was the only hope Junho had. Panic began to set in as Keisha realized the magnitude of the task before her. She scrambled away from the loading dock, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She ran around the perimeter of the massive stone building, searching for a way in. The main entrance was swarming with security, huge men with earpieces and bulges under their jackets that were unmistakably firearms. She slowed her pace, trying to look less like a threat and more like a confused passerby, but the moment she stepped onto the red carpet leading to the stairs, a heavy hand shoved her shoulder. "Get lost, trash," a security guard sneered, his face twisted in disgust. He didn't even look her in the eye, he just looked at the dirt on her dress. "This is a private event. Go beg somewhere else." Keisha stumbled back, catching her balance. "Please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. There's a bomb. You have to stop the wedding." The guard laughed, a cruel, barking sound. "A bomb? Right. And I'm the Queen of England. Get out of here before I break your legs." He shoved her again, harder this time, sending her sprawling onto the pavement. Passers-by looked away, uncomfortable with the scene, ignoring her distress. Keisha scrambled up, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. They wouldn't listen. Their prejudice was a wall thicker than the stone of the church. She circled around to the side entrance, usually reserved for the choir, but found it locked tight. She could hear the muffled sound of organ music starting inside. The ceremony was beginning. Time was running out. She looked up at a stained glass window that was slightly ajar, too high to reach. Desperation clawed at her throat. She found a loose brick in the garden bed and smashed the lock of a side service door. The noise was loud, but the organ music masked it. She pushed the door open and slipped into the dim, cool interior of the sacristy. The air smelled of incense and beeswax, a holy scent that masked the stench of the impending betrayal. She could hear the priest's voice droning through the thick walls, the Latin phrases echoing in the cavernous main hall. Keisha's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird as she navigated the labyrinth of corridors behind the altar. She was an intruder in the house of God, a beggar in a palace of thieves, but she moved with a singular, desperate purpose. She found a heavy velvet curtain and peered through a sliver of a gap. The sight was breathtaking and terrifying. Hundreds of guests sat in the pews, a sea of black suits and designer dresses. At the altar, Junho stood stiffly, his face a mask of stoic resignation. Beside him, Sumin looked radiant in white, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a predator's grin. Keisha scanned the altar, her eyes darting frantically. She didn't know where the bomb was, only that it was beneath them. The priest raised his hands. If anyone here has just cause, the irony was sickening. The timer the men had mentioned, set for the Eidos, was ticking down. She had seconds. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her fear. She couldn't shout from here. The organ was swelling for the vows. She had to move. She had to be the intervention. With a silent prayer to a god she thought had forgotten her, Keisha threw back the curtain. She didn't think about the security guards, the guns, or the social impossibility of what she was doing. She thought only of the fire she knew was coming. She sprinted. The transition from the shadows to the bright lights of the altar was blinding, but she didn't slow down. The gasp of the crowd was a physical wave of sound, but Keisha was already moving faster than their shock. She reached the altar, her bare feet slapping the marble, and in that frozen moment before the violence, she locked eyes with Junho. She saw the confusion, and then, as she grabbed him, she saw the dawn of realization. She hauled him back, the fabric of his suit tearing, and they tumbled together off the dais, crashing onto the hard floor just as the world turned white. The force of the explosion was a physical blow, a giant, invisible hand that swatted them across the alleyway like discarded dolls. For a moment, there was no sound, only a high-pitched ringing that screamed in Junho's ears, drowning out the world. He was lying on his back on the dirty asphalt, staring up at a sky that was rapidly filling with black, oily smoke. His chest heaved, his lungs burning with dust and pulverized stone. Slowly, the sound rushed back in, a cacophony of screams, shattering glass, and the roar of flames consuming the church he had just been standing in. He coughed, rolling onto his side, and spat out grit and blood. His mind was reeling, trying to piece together the fractured reality. The altar. The vows. The girl. His eyes snapped open. The girl. He scrambled to his knees, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. She was lying a few feet away, curled in a fetal position, covered in gray dust that made her look like a statue toppled from its pedestal. "Hey," Junho rasped, crawling over to her. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her shoulder. She groaned, a low, pained sound that was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard because it meant she was alive. He carefully rolled her over. Her face was streaked with soot, and blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, but her eyes fluttered open. They were wide, terrified, and painfully young. Did we make it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Junho looked back at the gaping hole in the side of the cathedral, where the altar had been obliterated. If they had been there 1 second longer, just one, they would be nothing but ash. He looked back at her, at the tattered dress and the malnourished frame, and felt a surge of gratitude so intense it almost brought him to his knees. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We made it." "You made it." He started to help her sit up, but the sound of crunching gravel made him freeze. His instincts, honed by years of survival in a brutal world, kicked in instantly. He shifted his body, placing himself between Keisha and the alley entrance, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon he wasn't carrying on his wedding day. Through the haze of smoke and dust, figures emerged from the back of the church lot. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't the fire department. It was Chairman Park, flanked by 3 of his top enforcers. They weren't running in panic, they were walking with the calm, predatory gait of men coming to inspect a kill. Sumin was with them, her pristine wedding dress now smudged with ash, but her face devoid of the grief a bride should feel. She looked annoyed. Junho felt a cold rage settle over him, displacing the shock. The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. The merger, the wedding, the location, it was all a setup. A public execution disguised as a tragedy. Chairman Park stopped 10 feet away, his eyes widening slightly as he saw Junho rising from the debris, battered but very much alive. The disappointment on the older man's face was fleeting, quickly replaced by a mask of faux concern that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. Junho. Park called out, stepping forward, though his hand hovered near his jacket pocket. My God, are you all right? We thought. The gas line, Junho stood up slowly, helping Keisha to her feet and keeping her tucked behind him. He wiped the blood from his lip, his posture shifting from victim to warlord. Gas line. Junho repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Is that the story, Park? A gas line right under the altar? Timed exactly for the vows. Sumin stepped forward, her eyes narrowing at Keisha. Who is this? She sneered, pointing a manicured finger at the trembling woman. And why isn't she dead? The slip was subtle, but loud. Junho laughed, a dark, humorless sound. Why isn't she dead? That's what you're asking? Not, is my husband okay? He took a step forward, and Park's men tensed, hands going to their waistbands. You missed, Park, Junho growled. You missed because of her, he gestured to Keisha. A woman you wouldn't even look at in the street just outsmarted your entire organization. The tension in the alley was palpable, a lit fuse. Park's facade dropped. He sneered, motioning to his men. Finish it. No witnesses, but before they could draw, the roar of engines filled the alley. Junho's own security detail, led by the hulking Daehyun, screeched into the alley in 3 armored SUVs, drifting sideways to create a barricade. Doors flew open, and a dozen men with automatic rifles poured out, training their weapons on Park and his small crew. The tables hadn't just turned, they had flipped. The standoff was brief. Outnumbered and outgunned, Chairman Park raised his hands, his face paling as the reality of his failure set in. Daehyun rushed to Junho's side, his face a mask of panic. Boss. We heard the blast. We thought. Junho held up a hand, silencing him. Secure them, he ordered, pointing at Park and Sumin. Do not let them leave. The police are coming, and they're going to hear the truth about this accident, as his men disarmed the traitors, forcing them to their knees in the dust. Junho turned his back on the vengeance he was entitled to. He had more important matters to attend to. He turned back to Keisha. She was leaning against the brick wall, sliding down slowly as the adrenaline faded and the shock took over. She looked small, fragile, and utterly out of place amidst the heavily armed mobsters. Junho knelt beside her, ignoring the ruin of his tuxedo trousers. He took her hands, which were rough, calloused, and shaking uncontrollably. Hey, he said softly, his voice gentle, a stark contrast to the commands he had just barked. Look at me. You're safe now. Nobody is going to hurt you. Keisha looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. I heard them talking, she stammered. I couldn't let you die. Junho shook his head in disbelief. You didn't even know me. You risked your life for a stranger. Keisha shrugged weakly. A life is a life. It doesn't matter whose it is. The simplicity of her morality struck Junho harder than the explosion had. In his world, a life was a commodity, something to be traded or taken. To her, it was sacred. He carefully picked her up in his arms, lifting her as if she were made of porcelain. Daehyun, he shouted. Get the car. We're going to the hospital. Not for me. For her, as he carried her toward the waiting SUV, leaving the wreckage of his wedding and his enemies behind, Junho realized that the woman in his arms wasn't just a savior. She was a mirror showing him everything he had lost in his pursuit of power. 3 days later, the sunlight streamed into the private suite of the city's best hospital, illuminating the room with a warmth that felt like a promise. Keisha sat up in the bed, wearing a clean, soft robe, her hair washed and braided. The doctors had treated her for a concussion, minor burns, and severe malnutrition. For the first time in years, her stomach was full, and her body wasn't aching from the cold. The door opened and Junho walked in. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a tactical vest. He wore a simple sweater and slacks, looking more like a man and less like a myth. He carried a large basket of fruit and a thick envelope. He pulled a chair up to the bedside, his expression serious but kind. "The doctors say you're going to make a full recovery," he said, placing the basket on the table. Keisha nodded shyly. "Thank you. For everything. This room. The food. I can't pay you back," Junho laughed softly, shaking his head. "Pay me back? Keisha, you gave me a life. There is no currency on earth that can repay that." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Park and his daughter are in custody. My lawyers are ensuring they go away for a very long time. The war is over and I won. Because of you." He picked up the envelope and held it out to her. "Inside this is the deed to an apartment in the city, fully paid for. There's also a bank account in your name with enough money to ensure you never have to worry about a meal or a roof ever again." Keisha stared at the envelope, her hands trembling as she took it. Tears spilled over her cheeks. "Why?" she whispered. You're not just anything," Junho interrupted firmly. "You're a hero, Keisha. You are the most honorable person I have ever met, and you deserve a life of safety, respect, and opportunity." He took her hands again, looking directly into her eyes. "This is not charity. This is gratitude. This is a chance for you to build the life you deserve, a life you earned with your courage." Keisha, overwhelmed, could only nod, tears streaming down her face. She looked at the envelope, then at the strong, kind face of the man who now owed her everything. The fear and hunger that had defined her existence for so long began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. Junho stood, a faint smile on his lips. "Rest now. When you're ready, a car will take you to your new home." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "And Keisha," he added, his voice softer, "if you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." As the door clicked shut, Keisha looked around the luxurious room, then down at the envelope in her hands. The city that had once been a cruel, indifferent monster now offered a glimmer of a future she could never have imagined. A homeless girl, invisible to society, had saved the most powerful man in the city, and in return, he had pulled her from the jaws of despair, offering her a new beginning, a testament to the unexpected bonds forged in the face of death.